Hi everyone, hope you're all well. I'm here again to speak to you this time about transitional policing for week 4 for HSP314. Now, as per usual, I've got some graphics on my first slide, and you can see that they're working. This is police working in various states in international contexts. One of the pictures shows a whole bunch of police women in blue helmets. These are what are called CivPol, which is UN or UNPOL, United Nations Civilian Police Officers, which are often taken, so they might get a whole bunch of police from Africa and then take them over to Indonesia where there's something happening there, and they are put to work in that other jurisdictional context. We can see AFP officers here, I think, working in Fiji or Indonesia. And then we can see other AFP officers also working in situations where it looks like there's been some sort of natural disaster, like an earthquake. These are probably the most common types of circumstances where we see policing in transitional states. So we're talking about politically transitional states where there's been a military coup or something else, or a transitional state that's come out of some sort of major emergency. So what we mean then by transitional policing is the establishment of legitimate, accountable police services in countries in democratic transition. So the UN CivPol focuses on what's called the SMART model, and SMART actually stands for particular things. And this was until the end of the 1990s, it had this specific focus. SMART is support, monitoring, administering, reporting and training. So these 5 things were things that the UN civilian police officers were going over to other countries to do. But CivPol at that stage didn't have the capacity to arrest or detain suspects. So they expanded their gambit, I suppose. I can never remember the right word to say there. They expanded it to also incorporate advisory roles, mentoring roles, law enforcement, selection, recruitment, training, and establishment of a local credible police force. No pressure. That's pretty bloody hard work. Human rights, humanitarian issues such as aid and so forth, looking after and actually putting into place elections, and looking after people such as internally displaced persons, and looking after internally displaced persons, so people who are displaced based on a natural disaster, for instance, within a country, and returnees, so people that have had to go away and then to come back in a few months' time after things have been rebuilt. So the type of work that these police officers are doing are huge. It's really huge, considering the amount of folks they have and so forth to be doing that type of work. How does transitional policing come about? This is fairly straightforward. Natural disaster, war, and peacekeeping is done in those 2 types of situations, but it's also transitional policing happens and it's just peacekeeping alone. It's not about resolving crime and all of those types of things, but that can often pop up. There's capacity building programs. It could be as a result of political crisis or a coup, a state of emergency, a terrorist attack, and just basically any particular state of crisis in what we call developing democracies. So developing democracies often suffer really big issues, what we call intractable political and socio-economic problems. Intractable means that they just don't change. It's really hard to shift them. And this can involve having weak democratic institutions such as governments, having corruption across government organisations and policing organisations, military organisations, even private businesses get involved, and a weak rule of law. Having significant levels of poverty and inequality and not having the resources to be able to address those is very, very significant issues, because those issues often lead to different forms of crime and riots and so forth. And of course, high crime and societal instability, and those very much 3 and 4 are very much linked. Poorly institutionalised channels of police accountability and responsibility as well. Now, we've seen some areas do quite good work on this, but it takes a long time to try and get these forms of upheaval to settle. And we've seen this in relation to East Timor in particular. So the original intervention was in 1999. They created a provisional police force. They were responsible for all local policing, but staffed by officers from different countries, mostly lacking local knowledge and skills. And often because they were from these other countries, they did not have to adhere to the laws of the country that they were in. That was a big problem. We saw them getting involved in all sorts of corruption and crime because they thought, well, the local laws don't apply to me, I can do whatever I want. They have wildly diverse skills, ages, ranges of experience, standards, policing styles, educational backgrounds, even basic knowledge on human rights was something that a lot of them didn't have at all. Or they'd seen police in their own countries of origin and their own policing organisations of origin where they had come from, involved in really high-level crime and corruption. So they just thought that was standard practice and that they could apply that in the country that they were then working in. And they saw really big problems with this in East Timor. So the transitional police that were put in place in East Timor were tasked with building professional, accountable, politically neutral, rights-respecting domestic police forces capable of taking over local policing responsibilities in what was essentially a multi-ethnic, multilingual society in a post-conflict state, newly independent country with fragile state institutions, few resources, scant rural penetration, so hardly any of the resources actually reach the people who were living in rural areas, deep economic, social and governance problems. What a huge, that is just, for want of a better term, a clusterfuck. There's so many issues there, and these people with very few skills and experience to draw on were put in and told, well, you have to basically fix all the problems of this world, which is, it's not appropriate to do that. So it took them 4 attempts before they were finally able to see significant traction towards reform in East Timor, and it took 6.5 years to get to that point. And of course, the 5th attempt that they went over led to a massive law and order breakdown in 2006. So these types of policing can take a lot of work and significant amounts of time, depending on what the circumstances are. We've got the AFP International Deployment Group. They were established in 2004. They were the first international policing organisation solely dedicated to policing efforts in transitional states. So even though we had things like Europol and Interpol and so forth, they really didn't have much of a role in transitional states at that particular point. The ultimate purpose was policing missions internationally to build capacity of foreign police forces to maintain law and order in an efficient and legitimate manner. And they've got a whole bunch of different points here about the International Deployment Group. It's Australian-based members. It's made up sometimes of mission-based, mission component members, sworn and unsworn personnel deployed to or ready to deploy overseas, depending on what the circumstances are in the event of a terrorist attack or in the event of a natural disaster, for instance. Then we've got specialist response groups, highly skilled and tactical and specialist policing capabilities for rapid deployment to domestic and international operational situations. So forensic police in this instance, would have been deployed to Bali in the Bali bombings and in the event of tsunami and so forth. So transitional policing is very much about post-conflict reconstruction, connected to transnational crime and terrorism in particular, but also connected to states of emergency, major natural disaster, because we often see crime and terrorism happen in those circumstances after major disasters in particular. There's international operations involving two types of activity: policing, building police capacity across a broad spectrum of areas, and I think I've covered off on all of those already. And of course, those associated with law enforcement cooperation programs. So drug trafficking, counter-terrorism, they start as rapid responses to emergencies, for instance, but they end up being developed into capacity building programs over a long period of time, because some emergencies take a long time. A good example of that is Katrina, where even 10 years post-Katrina, we were still finding that there were an apparent lack of basic level controls in place, an apparent lack of housing for people in local areas, etc., etc. So, like all other types of policing in transitional states can very much raise quality issues. So, for instance, we need to educate a host population that the police provide a service for the protection of citizens rather than the security of the state. Because in some areas of the world, particularly developing democracies, we see that the police act as arms of the state, and they will just go into people's houses and shoot people and so forth. They don't have, and you know, when police are transported into these types of areas, they think these police officers are not going to protect them, that they're actually there just to serve the needs of the state. Some officers are ill-equipped, poorly qualified with policing experience, which finds no basis in human rights compliance. This is probably one of the biggest issues that we have moving forward in these forms of these different forms of policing. And we can see here in this particular photo, we've got pictures of we've got AFP officers here, and then we've got a military police officer in the same shot, and they need to be working together. Even though they come from different backgrounds, they need to have the same types of knowledge about human rights and all of that sort of stuff as well. And domestic forces are often reluctant to engage. They're better experienced and better trained officers. So if they, you know, it might be that a particular area, Fiji, has asked Tasmania Police if they can send 50 officers over there. Tasmania Police are particularly reluctant to send those people that have particular skills because they'll still be in demand down here. So they'll send people who may have less skills. I'm not saying that this has happened. This is just a hypothetical example that I'm giving you. But that does tend to happen. They don't want to send their most skilled officers, so they can end up sending officers that don't have the requisite level of skills. And of course, this ends up creating a whole lot of different forms of misconduct. We've seen recently serious misconduct, rape and sexual assault and sexual exploitation rings and so forth have been set up by UN police officers, UN CivPol in these transitional states, because they just have no understanding about what they are supposed to do and what they're not supposed to do. They think the local laws don't apply to them. And often when we look at the legislation, they in fact don't apply to them, and they can't bring those police officers to justice. Things are changing a little bit, but we've got a long way to go in that respect at this particular point. And there's a few links for you to read about that online there. We have covered a lot of ground over this lecture and the last one. Hopefully you get a sense of what cross-border means, the fact that this can be across state borders within a country as well as across international borders in relation to transnational policing and crime. And that you've got some sense about what transitional policing is and how this can involve different forms of peacekeeping and the transnational nature of those forms of policing. And of course, how across both of those areas, we can't take for granted things like human rights, and that these forms of policing are necessarily going to lead to good outcomes for the countries involved. They can often be quite exploitative, and we need to keep that in the forefront of our minds when we're thinking about this, and think critically about the impact that it can have on people's human rights. That's it for now. Thanks for listening, guys. I really appreciate it. You have a wonderful rest of the day and a fabulous week. See you later.